What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with another episode of Lions Latest, going through the latest Detroit Lions news, man. We have a trade to talk about today, so let's get it started. Welcome to the channel video. Glad you guys are here. And yes, man, we're back with some Lions news. I'm excited about this one. It's not going to be a full deep dive, full breakdown like some of the free agent videos that we've done and also draft picks that we've taken a look at, but it is going to be a little bit of a deeper look at the player that the Lions have acquired in this trade. Also, we have some other news that was reported today through the Detroit Lions in terms of roster moves, so we'll touch on those as well. But this is exciting, man. There's not a ton going on at this time, but training camp is going to get started soon. I believe Saturday, the veterans report. So, things are going to start kicking off. We're definitely going to see a lot of roster movement, so that's something to keep an eye on. Now, this trade was announced last night, like 10 p.m. Eastern time. I think I saw it, and I was like, hey, I'm going to go home. I'm going to talk about this. Just do a quick little update. For whatever reason, my Wi-Fi was down. There was no, weather issues. I don't know. Wi-Fi was down. I got the text. They were like, hey, man, your Wi-Fi is down. You know what? I'll wait till tomorrow. So here we are, and we're going to talk about that move a little bit more, because if I did it yesterday, I really wouldn't have had much detail about the player because I didn't really get to watch him that much, so it would have been kind of me scrambling. But today I had an opportunity to dive into the film a little bit more. We definitely could revisit this in a deeper sense, but I feel like it's a really good starting point right now for what I think about the player that the Lions acquired. But before we get to that trade move, let's start off with a couple of other roster moves that were announced today by the Detroit Lions. We'll start there first. So the first one, the Detroit Lions reportedly are releasing kicker Michael Badgley. Now, they needed to create a roster spot. You have the 90-man roster at this point in the offseason heading into training camp, so they decided to release the veteran kicker. Now, keep that in mind. He will not go through waivers because of how long he's been in the NFL, so that could definitely be part of it if the Lions are thinking about potentially trying to add him back if they can create another roster spot. Him not going through waivers could be part of that reason. Also, keep in mind they have two other kickers still currently on the roster. They made the trade for Riley Patterson this offseason, so there's that. And you have John Parker Romo, who was a UDFA signing by the Detroit Lions this offseason. So maybe they like those two guys and they just want to roll with those two for competition. Maybe they want to try to get Badgley back if they can open up a roster spot. I don't think there's any guarantee that he'll be brought back, but of course he doesn't have to go through waivers, so maybe there's a better chance there. Badgley wasn't bad for us this past season, 20 of 24. Now, we went through some of the comparison between him and Riley Patterson. Definitely go check out the Riley Patterson video. We looked at some of the efficiency there, so I won't dive too much into that, but it's something to keep an eye on. Also, it was reported that he really wasn't taking kicks at minicamp or OTAs for the Lions, so maybe he was dealing with some sort of injury. I don't know. It wasn't really ever fully explained from my understanding, from what I've seen. So we'll kind of keep an eye on that situation. But as of now, Michael Badgley has been released. If he's not brought back by the Lions, wishing him the best. I think he definitely showed up and stepped in a pretty big spot for the Lions this past season and was better than I think a lot of us remember because of all the kicker rotation that we had. He was pretty good in terms of accuracy for the Lions. He may not have had the biggest leg, but he was pretty accurate. So, again, wishing him the best of luck going forward, but the Lions need to create a roster spot. Also, the Lions designated a few players to the NFI list. Now, this is somewhat similar to what we saw last year with a guy like Jameson Williams. NFI meaning non-football injury related. So we saw with Jameson Williams, he had his injury that he was recovering from back in college at Alabama. So it didn't necessarily count as an NFL injury because it was in college. So the notable name here, of course, is Hendon Hooker, who is being placed on the NFI list for the Detroit Lions for similar reasons. You're talking about a guy that's recovering from an ACL injury, and as he touched on, it could take, somewhere between 9-10 months. Hopefully, we'll get to see him next season. I think that's kind of what we're looking forward to more than really this year. It kind of feels like a redshirt year in a sense, but, he could potentially be brought back towards the end of the season. I'm definitely excited to see what Nate Sudfeld looks like on our team in preseason. We got to see him with San Francisco, but if you remember, we picked him up after preseason because our two quarterbacks maybe didn't play that great for us. So when we picked up Nate Sudfeld, we never got to see him play for the Lions. He checked in for one game. We were beating the Bears pretty bad, but I think he was sacked on that player, hit as he threw it. So that's it. That's all we got to see from Sudfeld. So I want to see what that dude looks like in the preseason because he's probably going to be our backup unless something changes. But with that being said, Hendon Hooker was placed on the NFI list as well as Zach Morton, the edge rusher that we picked up as an undrafted free agent out of Akron. We've talked about him a little bit. I don't think we've talked about all the UDFAs, so I may revisit that. I started watching a guy like Trevor Nowalski. I think that's how you say his name. That's probably not how you say his name. I started watching him. That guy is a that guy's a pretty impressive athlete, so we may have to dive into that as well, touch on some of those final players. And then also Derek Deese Jr., a former UDFA pickup by the Detroit Lions, a tight end. So all three of those guys have been placed on the NFI list. What the heck does that mean? Essentially, it means you're still going to count towards the 90-man roster if you are on the NFI list, but you will not be able to practice at training camp if you're on the NFI list. Now, if you're on the NFI list, you're placed on it this time, you can be taken off of the NFI list at any time before the start of the season, and then you can immediately practice. However, if you go into the season and you're still on the NFI list, you have to miss the first 4 games of the season before they are eligible to come back and play. So, these guys can be taken off that list. You're just essentially going to miss the beginning of the season if you're not taken off before the beginning of training camp. But we've seen things like this happen. Again, I don't really anticipate Hooker's going to be taken off of this list, but, I don't know. We'll see. Either way, that's what we have in terms of roster moves. Outside of the big one, which was the trade that went down last night. You know how the Lions do. They like make them late night deals. You know what I'm saying? At night. Here is the trade. If you haven't heard, you probably have. We're going to dive into the player a little bit here. But the Detroit Lions reportedly are trading for wide receiver Denzel Mims from the New York Jets. Now, it was reported, I believe, on Wednesday that he was essentially going to get released if they weren't able to find a trade partner for Denzel Mims, who is now on the final year of his rookie contract. And the Lions swooped in and essentially said, okay, you know what? We'll take him. We don't want the guy to just get let go and potentially not be able to pick him up. And there's also conditions to this trade, from my understanding, which are pretty great for the Lions. First off, of course, when you look at his contract, there isn't a multi-year deal here. He's on the last year of his rookie deal, so there's really no, long-term effect to this. The Lions currently have cap space, so there's that side of it. There's not much of a long-term risk here, unless, of course, you extended him, but that's a whole separate move, and you won't just extend him for no reason. And then also, when you look at the trade details, which is the Detroit Lions reportedly sending a conditional 6th-round pick in 2025, and in return, they are getting Denzel Mims plus a 2025 7th-round pick. So it's a late-round pick swap in 2025, plus we get Denzel Mims. But from my understanding, the conditions are, if the guy doesn't make the 53-man roster, the final 53-man roster for the Lions, so if we look at him in training camp like, this guy, he's not going to beat out, I don't know, Antoine Green, or maybe it's a UDFA signing. If he's not going to make that roster, the trade doesn't go through. So the picks aren't even swapped at that point, from my understanding, which is essentially no risk for the Lions really whatsoever, because if he makes the final 53 in some way, even if it's just special teams, you're probably going to want the guy to see the field. So it feels like there's not really any risk here for the Lions. I mean, of course, if the trade goes through, yeah, you are swapping picks, which can be crucial, maybe that time of the draft, but it's not anything major that the Lions are giving up here. So I think it's great that there's not much of a risk to this trade just in general, because, watching the player, the lack of production, the injuries, how rough it's been with the New York Jets, you wouldn't want to probably throw much of like, oh man, we are locked into this. If this doesn't work, this might be a problem. You don't really want that here. Now, I know there's been a lot of talk about the Lions receiver depth. I didn't feel like it was a huge issue, but that was also looking at a guy like Antoine Green and kind of anticipating that he would make the roster. If a guy like Antoine Green didn't make the roster, now you could have some real potential questions at receiver depth. Specifically on the outside, we have Khalif Raymond, we have St. Brown, we got Josh Reynolds, we got Marvin Jones Jr., then we have the Antoine Greens, and we know Jameson is dealing with the suspension. But if Antoine Green doesn't necessarily show up in maybe training camp or preseason like you want him to, and I'm not saying that maybe he doesn't make the roster, but maybe I guess he ends up on like the practice squad or something like that, you could have some legitimate questions. Or if you had like an injury on the outside for whatever reason, you could be asking that guy to step in, so you'd want to feel comfortable with that. So it's not a problem to add more depth here. I didn't think it was necessary in terms of the Lions like needed to get big time production on the outside, so I didn't think it was like Lions need to go add D-Hop. I didn't think they need that. I think production, we have enough guys to give us production in the receiving game, but at very least, yes, this adds some depth, at least in terms of competition. But I think it's more so for that, for sure, is to add some competition. And you're still talking about a very young player who it feels like, it's like, man, there still feels like there's something here, because he just hasn't consistently seen the field. Even when healthy, he hasn't consistently seen the field. He's only 25 years old, as I touched on. He's still on that rookie deal. He is a former 2nd-round pick out of Baylor by the New York Jets back in 2020. When you look at some of the testing scores, and Rad's going to love it. Rad, if you're watching this, this is for you. If not, it's okay. It's for everybody else. He does remind me of one player. One guy came to mind just based on the build, and it wasn't immediate. I was watching him a little bit, and I was like, he's got a similar build to a guy named Tyrell Williams. I'm just throwing it out, and he actually does. When you look at the testing and all of those things, it actually does test out extremely similarly. So you look at a guy like Denzel Mims, who listed in coming out of the draft at almost 6'3", 207 pounds, a little bit of a bigger frame type of receiver, long arms, almost 34 inches there, 4.38 40, 1.5 110-yard split, 38.5-inch vertical, a 6.663 cone drill. So the testing scores were all really good. And you could compare that to a guy like Terrell Williams, who was with the Lions back in 2021, but we only saw him play like 3/4 of a game because of an injury. 4.4 340, a 1.5 110-yard split. Granted, these are all at a pro day, as he was an undrafted free agent, but a 39.5-inch vertical, 6.743 cone drill, 6'3.5", 204. So I think in terms of build, if you're like, who could this remind me of? I think of a guy like Tyrell Williams. Now, I think their play style is arguably a little bit different, but I think in terms of build, you could see some similarities there. And then I even took a look at what we asked Williams to run in terms of route tree back in that first game against San Francisco. Slants, drags, speed out routes, digs, curls, that kind of thing. But it wasn't really a big sample size to take a look at. So let's just focus on Denzel Mims and what I've seen so far of watching this player. First off, you have to take a look at the injury history here, because there is a legitimate injury history for Denzel Mims. It's been part of the reason that he hasn't seen the field consistently. Injury heading into 2020, 2019, he had hand surgery. In 2020, his first season, you had a hammy injury, a hamstring injury in training camp. Also one that placed him on IR, which forced him to miss 6 games, which again is part of kind of the, as they say, stunting the growth of the player. He also had a concussion 2021. He had the hip strain. He had a finger injury. He also in 2021, I guess he had food poisoning, minicamp, which kind of threw him off. He's had to deal with multiple offensive schemes in just a limited amount of time in the NFL. So there's been a lot of, I guess you could say, catching up to do in terms of the time that he's missed, the changes that they've had around him. There's been a lot of inconsistencies of just being able to get out there and learn and grow. And we'll see if he can pick it up with the Lions. But it was when Robert Saleh said, essentially, if you're not one of the top 3 receivers, you have to be able to play multiple positions. And for him, because of the time that he missed, maybe he wasn't necessarily there in the playbook, so it led to inconsistent playing time, specifically in 2021. So with all that being said, there's of course that side of it. And then there's the player side of it when you watch the guy play. Now the statistics, I'll throw them on the screen. There's really nothing to point out here. His most productive season was his rookie season, so I guess there was a little bit of flash there. And a lot of people thought he might go higher than he did in the draft because of his height, weight, and speed. Like a lot of that's like, oh yeah, this guy. But there was a limited route tree that he came out with and things like that. So, it was kind of understandable. Then you also look at 2021, 2022. There's just not a lot to look at statistically. I dove into the 2022 games that he played in. Of course, there was a lot of production there, and also some of the 2021 as well. And I'm going to tell you what I've seen at this point from watching the player. Things that I like, maybe things that I didn't necessarily love in his game. First off, you start with him as a route runner. You notice very quickly he's a long strider, very long strider. His routes kind of play to that, so I think you really want to kind of play towards his strengths as a route runner in terms of understanding that's what he's good at. And there are things that he excels at as a route runner. I don't look at him as like, man, that guy is crisp, but there's things that he excels at which makes sense to his body type. And it's also, you could say, without having a Jameson Williams, if he can make the 53 and prove that he should get some snaps, he could help us in the sense that he does bring some of that really good speed. I won't say the JMO speed, but really good speed with size. I love a guy like Khalif Raymond, but I also love Khalif Raymond underneath. And I feel like there's been inconsistent production when trying to get him vertical, and some of that can just be because of size. Like, it's a harder threat to hit when your guy is 5'9" running deep. But when you're talking about a guy that's almost 6'3", that's a whole different situation, especially in this kind of body type with that type of speed. But when you watch him specifically as a level 3 type of route runner, see a couple things that stand out there. First off, the hesitation ability to get over top. When you're talking about some of those double moves, the nice little hezzy that he puts on some of these cornerbacks, it reminded me somewhat of some of those Jameson Williams highlights. I remember our old intro, we had him kind of doing the stop start and he was able to get over top there. You see some of those flashes when you watch him, even if he's not coming up the reception, just to be able to get over top. He obviously has an ability to stack cornerbacks, and he can kind of eat up off coverage a little bit better because of some of those strides, and he gets into his stride very quickly. So if you're talking about some of those level 3 type of route runs, I love the hesitation move that he pulls off to get over top, create really good distance out of his breaks. You're talking about more of the level 2 type of routes, your dig routes, things like that. The ability to create the kind of separation that he can out of breaks. Even though he doesn't have elite burst, I think, out of breaks, or it's not always as crisp to sink and cut, he kind of plays into that, as you see this past year as a route route runner, as I'll touch on, but he definitely can create distance. And I think a big reason for that, especially against zone coverage, are those strides. And you'll see it when he's able to round it a little bit more. I would look for this guy on speed out routes, the corner routes, those kind of things, and then those dig routes over the middle, because he's able to create some of that separation. You see it when he's working behind linebackers against zone. Maybe it's a cover 4, it's an umbrella type of coverage, and he can really work right behind that linebacker, and you see those strides. Now, of course, some of my knocks here. First off, he's definitely a guy I think that rises at the top of the routes. It's not very crisp in terms of getting sync, working back to the ball, curl routes, comeback routes, creating separation consistently there, especially if there's help over top where a guy can play a little bit more patient with him. You don't see that ability to consistently create separation. You find the ways that you can win as a route runner, and at first I didn't appreciate it, but as you continue to watch him, you're like, okay, I can see that he's playing into his strengths a little bit here. See that, for example, off the line of scrimmage, the way I kind of wrote it down is that he attacks, jabs, and then he plays through the cornerback. So if he's playing a press coverage, which I don't think he's very consistent at beating press coverage, he doesn't have the quickness off the line of scrimmage to consistently beat press coverage, so he starts to lean into, I think, a lot more times winning with route strength at the build that he has. He also uses his hands pretty well. I thought in 2021, some of the clips I watched, it was kind of inconsistent with hand timing. I thought 2022 was better, making sure that he consistently had his hands ready for that combat because of how he plays, and you'll see it, he kind of leans into that. He's going to try to open up that leverage, essentially open up your chest, play through the chest early in the route. You're talking about some of those underneath routes, slants, drags maybe, creating separation early. You saw it against Okuda. Anybody that tried to maybe get physical or press him at the line of scrimmage and he was on the line of scrimmage, you saw him kind of use that route strength to his advantage. Essentially try to open up that leverage, set a jab, play through the body, and then bounce off and create separation that way. That's also another thing that I liked, I'll touch on, is the jab at the top of the route. Now this happens a little bit deeper down the field, but he has a nice little stab at the top of the route, again, to create leverage, create space into his breaks. That's another little thing that I think stuck out in terms of his route running. That will be crucial if a guy is sitting outside leverage and you need to go, you need to get outside. Maybe you're trying to run one of those, maybe comebacks, but maybe more of those deep outs. I think more of the Josh Reynolds route tree where he runs a lot of those deep, 15, 20 yard outs for us, where if you can open up a guy that's sitting outside leverage with some of those inside jabs, he's not necessarily as crisp, but if he can pace himself well with the timing of the route, that can help him open it up a little bit. Again, he's not going to be separating consistently at the top of the route with shiftiness. It's more so of the pacing of the route. I think there's a really good upside there in terms of attacking zone coverage. And I even saw a flash like this against the Buffalo Bills, which stood out to me, is where you saw some route variation. Again, I really think he lacks some quickness off the line of scrimmage, but especially when he's in the slot, if he has opportunities to have that three-way go, essentially, so you have more threats at the line of scrimmage. Here he's trying to pry open that inside leverage because he needs to get inside on this play, and you see kind of that little like skip release, and then he's able to get that inside leverage, and you see how quick he's able to do this off the line of scrimmage. That play flashed to me because it showed me a little bit of the ability there, and like, oh, there's a little bit more to this to create that inside leverage, win to the inside here against the Bills. Now, reason I bring up Tyrell as well, where he had a lot of success before he came to the Lions was in the slot. You have more options at the slot position, but then your strength has to be ability to run after the catch, those types of things, and also some body control as well. And when you looked at some of the route tree that he was running with the Jets, I was kind of like, man, what is this? First off, I thought timing was... There was a lot of like question marks in terms of timing. They went through a lot of quarterbacks. Of course, we talked about the scheme changes. So some of it to me was timing. Also, some of the route tree I didn't love. There was a lot of whip routes that he ran, kind of like reverse pivoting, inside. I think you saw some of the lower body control and maybe some of the flexibility there in terms of being able to control himself underneath. But I was like, what the heck is this? I mean, you see the one where they're kind of tumbling all over each other. Like the timing of routes were not ideal either, so that's also something that I didn't love. I thought something that he was successful with is being in motion pre-snap. Fast motion was something that you could utilize him in as well, getting him clean off the line of scrimmage, stacks, things like that, creating leverage that we could set up some of those stutters and goes, double moves over top. We saw that last year. I think of some of DJ Chark's big shots. I think of the Vikings game or against the cover 3 where, we had the pre-snap motion and he was able to get on top with a little double move. But I would like to see more urgency specifically off the line of scrimmage. I mean, that's where it stands out. I think sometimes it kind of looks like it's a little bit just the same speed. And I do think when you talk about timing within an offense, you can't put it all on, other factors. It's also going to be his consistency, especially against press. So that's where I thought you saw some hit and miss, and that obviously can throw off timing. So you're going to need that timing, of course, when you're attacking zone. But if he's clean, I trust that a little bit more than when he has to deal with combat at the line of scrimmage. And I think you could see a little more urgency because there's flashes of him just really getting off the line of scrimmage with other times where it doesn't look necessarily that way, a little more lethargic. As a pass catcher will go there before some of my rack notes, run after catch. I think he can really, I think there was a good ability to track the ball in the air. There wasn't a ton to look at in the games that I looked at because, again, there just wasn't a lot of production there. I almost would have to look back, I think, back at some of the Baylor things or maybe his rookie season. But I think there was good ball tracking. From what I know back of him in college and also taking a look at what I could, I thought the ball tracking was there. And that was really not just your deep shots, but it definitely makes me think about the ability with his length, and you see it at the line of scrimmage, but also at the catch point. I think of, again, those back shoulder fades. He had some success on stuff like that back in college. The red zone opportunity to be a threat, which he really hasn't been in the NFL, but he could be potentially if you trusted him to utilize some of that length and potentially throw some fades to him in the red zone. Like, that could be a real part of his game. I think about a Quintez Cephas. You remember his first, game with Goff here, and he threw that kind of like little back shoulder at the 2-yard line. He's no longer here, right? So maybe he can potentially fill a little bit of that role. But I do think of a guy like Chark who ran some of those back shoulders, and I know I pointed to Marvin Jones, but I think there's potential capability there. But really, the ball tracking downfield, really everywhere though, the ability to adapt and the body controls to passes that aren't really right on his frame. You see some of that body control, but also the ball tracking I think stands out. Now, his hands were not great, and I know there was questions coming out of college, and there was too many drops that I saw in just the games that I watched, and I probably went through like 8 games. Yeah, I think I have 8 listed here. Finishing through contact, I thought when contact got on him, maybe even if it was a little bit before the ball, of course that can be PI, but finishing through contact more consistently I think could be improved on. Also, it felt like making the catch first was just something that I wrote down. Just making the catch first. His eyes seemed to kind of fall off a little bit of where the ball was just in terms of finishing the process. He could adjust to it, but then it was like, hey, finish before you want to take off. And it was almost like when he was attacking middle field, attacking zone, whatever it may have been, something like that, and he kind of felt like a defender was kind of coming down on him a little bit, or if the timing was a little bit thrown off, it was like we didn't really finish the process always before we were looking to take off. So that was definitely something that's going to show up. I think you're going to have to say, man, he's got to look good in terms of his hands in the preseason. Now, I thought his overhand pass catching technique was pretty sound. I didn't like how there was a lot of unnecessary leaping into the air to make grabs that he really didn't need to. Some of it I point to timing. Again, I thought timing was off at times, like hitting zone holes and when do we need to hit those versus when the quarterback's going to throw it. I thought some of that was off. But also at the same time, for him as well, again, I think it comes back to being in traffic. Marvin Jones Jr. does some of this as well. Like, I'm not calling him a body catcher because he doesn't consistently need to catch everything with his body, and he can make some of those 50-50 grabs. He's really nice on the sideline in terms of sideline awareness, slowing himself down, all of those things, tracking the ball outside of his body. I think there was a lot of unnecessary leaping into the air. Again, I kind of come back to timing a little bit there. Then also being in traffic where he's kind of leaping for almost like no reason. Even some of them where they weren't in traffic, like the screen, it was like, why are you leaving the ground in this situation? So I didn't love that. And then finally, the run after catch. I think there's real potential here. First off, the urgency. Some of that was how he caught the ball, but I thought there was real urgency when he got the ball to go. Like, he really wanted to make something happen with the football. Maybe that was limited opportunities. I just want to make something happen, so maybe that needs to be pulled back for consistency as a pass catcher. But there was real urgency with the ball in his hands, and I thought with his build, there was plus contact balance. He's just a physical runner, so he did kind of drag guys an extra yard or two even when he was going down. So I think there also is some rack opportunity here, but I really look for him as a potential blocker on those screen plays. We talk about Antoine Green and what he can do after the catch. Hey, look for a guy like this. I mean, he has the build to block, and even though, he had a holding call and it wasn't always ideal, you did see when he did get his hands on guys, he could have some real effectiveness as a blocker. I look at this Bengals play where he's just driving a guy, like the guy can block, and I thought the effort was there. I didn't really question the effort too much as a blocker, so I really look at him as a guy that could help us some of those situations. Maybe that pops up on special teams, but we throw a lot of screens, and maybe he can make a little bit of an impact there as well. But he definitely has the physical build and also the play style to be able to be an effective blocker. I guess a route runner, I did like there was eye discipline. I thought that was improved upon. Make sure that he used his eyes to try to open up some routes, especially against off coverage, guys that are trying to peek quarterback man. You saw it against Patriots get over top, and the way that he would do that, first off, eye discipline, you see it on a little double move here, but also at the same time, when you were playing off coverage, he would try to change the pace of the route a little bit, which I thought was beneficial, especially on some of those vertical routes as well. Thought he lost burst out of breaks, but there was separation because, again, of the length of some of the strides that he could create second level. Even though the balance wasn't always ideal, he could create some space there. And to me, I think it's a worthwhile swing. I mean, look, ideal situation, a guy balls out, he lives up to the second round pick, he gives us size, speed, while J-Mo's not necessarily here right now. He'll compete with a guy like Antoine Green, and he could bring, you know, I think even a little bit of a different skill set than Antoine Green does. I think Green is in a good spot to learn here. I think what he could do after the catch, but I think he could bring a little bit of a different skill set. So you could bring some of that to the table. He fits in well, and it's a heck of a pickup for the Lions. Worst case scenario, he doesn't work out. We let him go, and it was like, okay, I mean, what does it really hurt here? The trade didn't go through. Maybe he doesn't make the 53-man roster. I guess worst case he makes a 53 and it doesn't go well and they have to let him go. But worst case I would think is he doesn't make the 53-man roster. You know, to me, I don't think there's a lot of risk to this outside of maybe a little financial reasons. But again, he's still in the rookie part of his deal. So Lions have cap space. It shouldn't be a huge issue outside of rollover, things like that. But with that being said, Denzel Mims is currently a Detroit Lion. Lions made some roster moves. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. We can definitely revisit this player. Thank you for watching, and I'm out.